preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Levi Darby. As Associate Director of Education for Jewish Education at the 92nd Street Y, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second program in a series of 4 dialogues entitled The Crisis of Jewish Liberalism. This series of 4 evenings is presented by the 92nd Street Y in celebration of the 10th anniversary of Moment magazine. Both the 92nd Street Y in its Jewish Omnibus program and Moment magazine are dedicated to serving as a forum for the discussion of the most pressing issues facing the Jewish community today. It is most fitting, therefore, that this landmark anniversary of a major Jewish publication be celebrated by a gathering of the community to discuss Jewish issues of import and significance. This evening's dialogue is entitled The Crisis of Liberal Zionism, and we are delighted and honored to have with us as our speakers Dr. Shlomo Avineri and Dr. Marie Syrkin. Shlomo Avineri is Herbert Samuel Professor of Political Science at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Between 1975 and 1977, he served as Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the government of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Having served as visiting professor at universities around the world, Professor Avineri is recognized as a leading authority on the thought of Hegel and Marx. His books on political theory have been translated into numerous languages and include his most recent work, Moses Hess, Prophet of Communism and Zionism. Marie Syrkin is Professor Emerita of the Humanities at Brandeis University and a former member of the World Zionist Executive. For many years, she was the editor of the Labor Zionist monthly Jewish Frontier. A well-known author, editor, lecturer, and professor, Professor Syrkin's works include the authoritative biography Golda Meir, Israel's Leader, Blessed is the Match, a widely heralded account of Jewish resistance movements under the Nazis, and a biography of her father, the socialist Zionist theoretician Nachman Syrkin, Socialist Zionist, a biographical memoir and selected essays. Her most recent book, The State of the Jews, was awarded the Bublik Prize by the Hebrew University in 1981. Leon Wieseltier, who was to be the third member of our panel this evening, unfortunately cannot be with us. He has asked me to send his regrets and to explain that he has just been married and is on his honeymoon this week. As to the format of the evening, following the prepared comments of our speakers and the moderated conversation on stage, there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to pose questions directly to the panel. Immediately following the program, there will be an informal wine reception for the audience in the lounge directly adjacent to this hall. Please do join us so that we might share in a glass of wine together and have an opportunity to greet our speakers. Our moderator for this evening and for the entire series is Leonard Fein. He brings to this task an array of skills and a breadth of knowledge. As the editor of Moment magazine, he is the visionary who brought the remarkable dream of this publication into reality. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator, Leonard Fein.
Typically, when we think about the tension between liberalism and Zionism, if we think about it at all these days, our disposition is to focus on the assorted threats to the liberal and democratic tradition in Israel that emanate both from Israel's precarious international situation and domestically from the extreme right in Israel. There is much talk these days of not merely the persona of Rabbi Kahana, but also of the nature of the support that he elicits in Israeli society. And perhaps tonight, indeed, there will be remarks and questions addressed to that facet of the tension between Zionism and its expression in the State of Israel and the liberal tradition. In framing the question, we had a rather subtler agenda, if you will, an agenda that has to do with the inherent tensions between a national movement, the movement for Jewish liberation and self-determination, and the democratic slash liberal slash pluralist tradition. A question that can perhaps be framed best by alluding to two or three specific areas of tension with which I hope we can grapple here together tonight. Many of you know that one of the fundamental laws of the State of Israel is called the law of return. The law of return, following Zionism's conception of itself and of the purposes of Jewish independence, holds that any Jew who comes to the State of Israel is as if he were returning to a land from which he had been forcibly expelled, and therefore automatically qualifies for citizenship. There is therefore no naturalization process for any Jew returning to his or her home. Question: is a law that gives that kind of priority and preference to Jews, as distinguished from all others, compatible with the conventional understanding of the liberal tradition? Israel has an anthem. It is not officially the national anthem of the state, but it is widely supposed that it is the official anthem, and it's certainly de facto the national anthem. It's called Hatikva. Its words include, among others relevant to the tension of which we speak, a line that reads, "Our eyes have been turned towards Zion these last 2,000 years." Question: can a state which seeks to be a liberal, democratic, pluralistic state have an anthem whose words are, for all practical purposes, unsingable by the 17% of its citizens who are not Jews? There is a place in Israel called Masada. Before there was a Masada complex, there was, if you will, a Masada cult. Early on, those responsible for making of the motley collection of immigrants to the land a nation thought it wise to develop symbols of Jewish autonomy reborn, and the myth of Masada, of a mass Jewish suicide back nearly 2,000 years ago, was a readily available myth. And so Masada and the celebration of what happened there, the slogan "Masada shall not fall again," became central features of the society as it was unfolding. It was a secular myth, in form very close to the religious myths that had sustained the Jewish people throughout their dispersion. Question: can it come as a surprise to the authors of the secular myth of the cult of Masada that of late a new and different cult, the cult of the temple rebuilt, has emerged and excited the imagination of a new generation of Israelis who are not satisfied with the secularity of the myth of Masada? In that question, I follow the notions of Meron Ben-Vinishti, who makes a great deal of the relationship between the two myths. Now, if I raise these problems, finally, I do so not to bury Zionism, nor manifestly to praise it, but to suggest that those of us who cling to the glory, the beauty, the productivity, the wisdom of Zionism, are well advised, even though others, the enemies of the Jews and the enemies of the Zion, may lash out, may rail against Zionism. We ourselves do well in the privacy of our own homes and fora to think through the inherent implications of the complex things we believe and of the realities, the complex realities to which those things have given rise. Not to bury those things, but the better to protect them. It's for that reason that I am so thoroughly pleased and privileged that our first speaker this evening is that wise Zionist Marie Syrkin.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Leonard Fein on the fact that what he has done with Moment, a superb magazine, and on the fact that it has lasted 10 years and is improving all the time. No, that's the wrong word to use if improvement suggests previous faults, but that's really an asset to Jewish periodicals, and as an editor of several struggling ones and on the editorial board of some, I know their tsaris. So my congratulations and my real applause is an authentic and professional one. Now, as to what I have to say, I didn't know, frankly, this was going to be the crisis of liberal Zionism. I thought it was just liberal Zionism. But I'm prepared to believe it's a crisis. But I confess I find the term liberal Zionism a bit puzzling. I know what is meant by socialist Zionism, revisionism, or religious Zionism, even though each of these encompasses factions ranging from moderate to extreme. Whatever refinements its exponents choose to espouse, each has explicit dogmas. Liberal implies an enlightened social attitude, with particular emphasis on individual freedom and human rights. However, just what that entails has varied in various historic periods. Don't be alarmed. I don't intend to go into a disquisition on this in the presence of Shlomo Avineri, and I'm not going to start with John Locke and go on to John Dewey. I wouldn't venture on it in the presence of a specialist. Nevertheless, simply as an ordinary layman observing the scene, in my own lifetime, I have had disconcerting experiences, not merely of changes and qualifications in the meaning of liberal, but of complete reversals of its original sense. When in the 1920s I began teaching in the New York high school system, the great victory of liberalism was the institution of a merit system, according to which a nice, diligent Jewish girl had a chance to get a job, even if her principal was bigoted and didn't want anyone except a WASP or a Catholic, provided she passed the appropriate examinations. At approximately the same period, the hue and cry that ensued upon the discovery that Harvard had a Jewish quota resulted in the abandonment of a system of selecting students by race or religion. In consequence, Jews were admittedly disproportionately represented in universities, not because of any newborn predilection for Jews, but because they passed particular tests in exceptional numbers. For a number of decades, this was hailed as evidence that the democratic principle of individual rights was working in practice. I have no intention, don't worry, of rehashing arguments about quotas, affirmative action, busing, and the like. I cite this example because many members in this audience probably take it for granted that only benighted reactionaries oppose quotas, and they probably reject meritocracy as a dirty word that can only be employed if safely sanitized by quotation marks. This is only one illustration in the transformation of values and the corresponding change of labels. What ideological tasters once dismissed as vinegar is now wine, and vice versa. Perhaps Gilbert hit it most happily in Iolanthe when he wrote, that every boy and every girl that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or a little conservative, especially as in a Gilbert and Sullivan comedy, a merry reversal of roles is always in the cards. What about liberal Zionism? By definition, it should not be dogmatic. It assumes an attitude rather than a creed, like labor Zionism or revisionism, nor is it a party, like Mapai or Likud. Actually, there is a liberal party in the Likud coalition, obviously no candidate for inclusion in the liberal Zionist front. Yet without belaboring the point unduly, and I think a few simple things should be said about it, I'll let the fancy stuff will be the other gentleman, not the other gentleman, the gentleman. A basic consensus can be found in the liberal camp on the major issues facing Zionism. These would include, and that is what I would say, that I would first of all accept as part of the definition of a liberal Zionist, agreement to withdraw from the occupied territories so as not to imperil the Jewish and democratic character of Israel through the incorporation of 1 million hostile Arabs. Second, a scrupulous regard for the individual rights of all Arab citizens, Jewish and Arab. And finally, opposition to the encroachments of religious orthodoxy on the political structure of a secular democracy. As a liberal, I view the attainment of these goals as essential to the viability of the Jewish state and to its survival as a democratic society. However, having noted the broad terms of agreement, dissenting voices within the liberal camp in regard to each of these issues should be noted. What about withdrawal? Should it be unilateral? Would it include the Golan Heights? What about the status of Jerusalem? What exactly are secure and recognized borders as specified by Resolution 242? I refer not to the program of the virulently anti-Zionist left, whose views have no bearing on our discussion, but to the conflicting proposals of authentic Zionist liberals. What about civil rights? This is a ticklish question, as in the United States, and even more pressing in Israel. Does liberalism protect the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie? Should Arab students enrolled in the Hebrew University have the right to use the campus for anti-Israel demonstrations? What may be censored under the plea of state security or public morals? And how will one disentangle the secular from the religious in a Jewish state? The Who is a Jew controversy involves not only rituals of conversion to which, as a secular Jew, I confess, fairly indifferent, but the more perplexing question as to whether a Jew who has embraced another religion can nevertheless legally claim to be a Jew on the basis of national affiliation. Is a Dominican monk, a converted Jew, justified in demanding Israeli citizenship under the law of return? No other people suffers from this peculiar Hebraic quandary. As a good liberal, I pretend to know absolute certainties in all these areas, particularly the third. Yet these questions, I think, should be raised and considered, but always in the context of Israel's specific situation. I stress Israel's situation because no prescription can be mechanically applied without regard for the condition of the patient. Despite my promise not to quote the great theoreticians of liberalism, let me make one exception. In his essay on liberty, a classic statement on the rights of dissent against, quote, the tyranny of the majority, an essay that's an eloquent espousal of untrammeled expression, no matter how evil the expression, John Stuart Mill, the great liberal theoretician, nevertheless made allowance for special conditions obtaining. Now I quote, "In small republics surrounded by powerful enemies, in constant peril of being subverted by foreign attack or internal commotion, and to which even a short interval of relaxed energy and self-command might so easily be fatal, even John Stuart Mill accepts the notion that all the liberal dogmas cannot apply rigidly." This sounds, his statement, like a preview of Israel's difficult, beleaguered state. Consider the question of withdrawal. Liberal Zionists agree that continued domination of unwilling Arabs on the West Bank is demoralizing to Israelis and unjust to Arabs. To what extent should considerations of security obtain? Labor favors withdrawal from heavily populated Arab areas, that is, the greater part of the West Bank, and the retention of given security points. I am no military strategist and cannot intelligently argue for particular borders. For this reason, I should like to call a relevant non-Zionist document to your attention. In June 1967, immediately after the Six-Day War, the American Secretary of State requested the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as to what minimum territory Israel might be justified in retaining to permit adequate defense against Arab attack and terrorist raids. The generals were instructed to prepare their memorandum without regard to political factors. The generals, blessedly oblivious of biblical patrimony and indifferent to any except military considerations, drew up what they considered was the minimum that Israel could retain for its safety. It was dated June 29, 1967, stamped secret, but recently declassified. As a minimum, the defensible borders for Israel, according to the Pentagon, was control of the high ground running north-south through the middle of the West Bank, and a defensive line that would run just east of Jerusalem. However, were Jerusalem to be internationalized, and the generals couldn't care less, the boundary could be established just west of the city. Israel should retain 15 miles of the high ground inside the Syrian border to prevent the shelling of Israeli villages. Anyone who stood on the Golan Heights will get the point. The Gaza Strip salient, according to the generals, should be retained, but the Sinai could be returned to Egypt without endangering Israel, except, and here this is really interesting in view of what happened, except for some 20 miles to protect the port of Eilat and access to the Gulf of Aqaba. So much for the generals. Sadat was less forthcoming when he insisted on the return of every grain of Sinai, including the lovely Israel village of Yamit that is now again desert. The Alon plan is more modest than that of the Pentagon. Nevertheless, in the diplomatic struggle at the United Nations that culminated in the semantically vague Resolution 242, the secret memorandum went unmentioned. But liberal Zionists, for whom equity includes both the Palestinian right to national independence and also the Israeli right to national security, might well take into account the politically untainted conclusions of the Chiefs of Staff as to what would constitute minimal defensible borders. Just as the demographic realities of the Arab presence on the West Bank render hollow assertions to a divine right to Samaria and Judea, even when bolstered by secular evidence that the West Bank was originally included in the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, so the history of Israel's vulnerable borders punctures Arab demands for sovereignty over every barren hilltop on the West Bank and every stone in the Golan. If Israelis must reject ancestral memories of biblical glory in their search for peace, Arabs too must accept the lessons provided by contemporary history if a rational compromise is to be reached. How about civil rights? What should the liberal conscience demand in this sphere? I think I have to put on my glasses. I assume there is general agreement that a monstrous figure like Kahana should be checked, though perhaps the American Civil Liberties Union is already preparing to take up cudgels in his defense to protect free speech. Fortunately, such an extreme, self-defeating interpretation of free expression has few adherents, and I shall waste no time in pointing out that the overwhelming majority of Israelis have minced no words in denouncing the danger and disgrace of the Kahana phenomenon. But to what extent should blatant anti-Israel attacks that unabashedly call for the elimination of Israel be tolerated in a country under siege, whether these attacks emanate from communists in the Knesset or Arab demonstrators. Leonard Fein, I believe, or perhaps it was Justice Holmes, said somewhere that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. A layman finds this sensible language reassuring. Liberals piously admire the ringing declaration attributed to Voltaire. I disagree with every word you say, but I will defend your right to say it with my life. I would add a heretical qualification, provided you do the same for me. I see no moral virtue, let alone common sense, in defending the rights of any group whose first act on acquiring power would be to stifle my right to dissent. Then you have a society stripped of all civil rights. And there are grayer areas. I recently saw a new wave Israeli motion picture, The Vulture, that aroused much debate in Israel and threats of censorship. The film is powerful and brilliantly acted. Placed in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, its theme is the moral degeneration of young, demobilized soldiers and their cynical indifference to the patriotic sentimentality of their elders. It stresses the futility of these endless deaths, generation after generation. No distinction is made between just and unjust wars. Note, the setting of the film is the Yom Kippur War, not the Lebanese adventure. The indictment is wholesale, overwhelming, even when the war is defense against desperate danger, as in the Yom Kippur War. Despite my recognition of the film's searing realism, I could not help wondering whether a small, embattled country that to survive may have to summon its youth again can afford the luxury of feeding the current disenchantment and the understandable weakening of morale in the population. Let me turn to a question that seems to me to involve the heart of the Zionist purpose. Within Israel and in the diaspora, outrage sporadically erupts among civil libertarians about the status of the Arab minority in Israel. I do not refer to violations of individual Arab rights. If and when these take place, obviously such violations should be prosecuted with the full weight of the law. But why are liberals shocked if an Israeli administrator, troubled by the diminishing Jewish population in Galilee, the scene of the legendary kibbutzim of the pioneer era, urges increased Jewish settlement in that region, stating frankly his fears that it may become an Arab enclave because of the higher Arab birth rate? Perhaps this particular administrator expressed himself tactlessly. But in what sense is a candid recognition of the need for increased Jewish settlement in Galilee an infringement of Arab rights? The same moral and pragmatic criteria that condemns settlement on the West Bank should encourage maximum Jewish settlement in Galilee or the Negev. Such an objection seems to me an instance of exaggerated liberal sensibilities. In his gracious letter of invitation to me, Leonard Fein suggested that participants in the symposium consider such questions as to whether it is not time to discard the law of return as outmoded and illiberal, particularly since opponents stigmatize the law as undemocratic. We all know in what historic circumstances the law of return was promulgated. Immediately upon its establishment, Israel declared to a world that had barred its gates to Jews fleeing from gas chambers that there was at last one spot on the globe to which every Jew might come and where he would be welcome. No more dramatic demonstration of how profoundly Jewish destiny had been changed by the rise of a Jewish state could have been devised. The law of return was the answer not only to an immediate, desperate need. Survivors languishing in D camps now had a haven, but it was also the necessary instrument for fulfilling the purpose for which Israel had been established, the creation of an independent Jewish state. What point had the partition resolution if its intent could be instantly nullified by overwhelming the small area of the Jewish state through an uncontrolled Arab influx? If you wish, the law of return was affirmative action to redress the century-old wrong of Jewish national homelessness. There is nothing in the current political and military situation to suggest that this bulwark for the protection of Israel as a Jewish state can be safely discarded. If we object to the incorporation of 1 million West Bank Arabs out of regard for the Jewish character of Israel, why open an easy avenue for its extinction by reducing controls on immigration? I'm skipping something here. Another question raised by Leonard Fein, and allied to this, is to the concern about the law of return, was whether Hatikva should be dropped as a national anthem, because the Arab minority in Israel cannot be expected to sing its lyrics. I have no particular enthusiasm for Hatikva as poetry or melody. I don't even know where the tune comes from. Were a more inspired song like the Marseillaise to be born, I would happily try to sing it at meetings and banquets. But I cannot accept objections to Hatikva because the song firmly expresses the age-old hope of Jews to live, I quote, and you recognize it, as a free people in their own land. That was the Zionist hope and remains the essence of Zionism. I do not understand how a Jewish state compromises its democratic character by asserting its Jewish being any more than the United States diminishes its democracy when it chants about the land of the Pilgrim's pride, even though the overwhelming majority of its citizens, and surely not the Indians, have small affinity to our Pilgrim fathers. It seems to me the questions raised highlight the double standard that is too often applied to any straightforward assertion of Jewish nationalism. I could understand such objections, though not agree, when the dream of internationalism still mesmerized progressive thinkers and all nationalism was disdained as parochial. But today, when every tribe is urged to gather around its totem pole and every fledgling nationalism is hailed as a liberation movement, I cannot understand over-nice reservations in regard to Jewish nationalism. Some years ago, the progressive journalist I.F. Stone was shocked by a statement of Ben-Gurion in which the latter said, I quote, Israel, this is Ben-Gurion, Israel is the country of the Jews. Every Arab who lives here has the same rights as any minority citizen in any country of the world. But we must admit the fact that he lives in a Jewish country. Stone observed, the implications must chill Jews in the outside world. Jewish progressives suffer no frostbite when they behold a French France, a Russian Russia, or a Chinese China. But they warm up to a fever point, and they warm up to a fever point in defense of Arab nationalism. This is an old, sad story. A Zionist, however, is by definition committed to the vision of national Jewish independence, in the words of Hatikva, a free people in its own land. Liberal Zionism must reject aggressive jingoism and a misguided messianism. It cannot forego the central tenet that constitutes the Zionist faith, then it would be neither Zionist nor liberal. We often speak with alarm of the Masada complex of the zealots in Israel, militants who in the name of nationalism are ready to destroy the nation. Perhaps we should worry a little bit about a Masada complex of another order in a liberal Zionism that perceives too finely, no pun intended, a violation of liberal righteousness in the Zionist vision, the right of the Jew to live as a free people in their own land. No matter how poorly I carry the tune, I shall continue to sing Hatikva with full conviction that I have not forfeited my liberal convictions by doing so.
First of all, I'd like to join with Marie Syrkin in congratulating Leonard Fein for the wonderful job he has done at the moment. My congratulations are tinged a little bit with envy. Not for Leonard as an editor, but for the American Jewish community for having such a magazine. I wish we had such a magazine in Israel. I wish perhaps you would be in Jerusalem editing such a magazine. But in any case, it is something which we do not have in Israel, and I greatly admire the stamina and the ability and the richness of mind and openness which characterizes that magazine, and I hope one day we will be able to have something similar in Israel. Our discussion this evening, as I think we already realize, echoes a sentiment which has been around since the late 18th century, when people in different countries and different climes, very different from our country and our climes, tried to change consciously the political structure and the social structure of their societies. And it seems to me that as a motto for our discussion tonight, we can perhaps use an aphorism attributed to a French 19th century historian when he said, "How lovely was the Republic under the monarchy." How lovely Zionism looked in the book. How lovely was the dream when the reality was dreary. How much more complex and problematic and searing is reality when we have to come to terms, not with our vision, but also with the historical context in which our vision is not really realized, but is trying to come to terms with its own vision and the difficulties on its way. Now, in this sense, it seems to me Israel shares a very typical Jewish predicament. Modern Jewish life, we are sometimes told, is based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. The way Jewish people live today in liberal, Western, democratic societies is an outcome, an outgrowth of changes within general society and changes within Jewish society, which we subsume under the rubric of Enlightenment. And this, of course, is true. I would like to add, however, that modern Jewish life lives under the twin sign of the Enlightenment, but also under the sign of the internal contradictions and inadequacies of the Enlightenment. Because if the Enlightenment would have really solved the problem, not only of Jewish existence, but also of Jewish corporate and communal identity, then there would be no Zionism, then there would be no soul searching, then the Jews would have disappeared, as so many French liberals thought during the French Revolution, into the general human fraternity of universal, undifferentiated mankind. What Zionism did, and what the Enlightenment was not ready to grant the Jews, was the public nature of Jewish existence. What Enlightenment usually was ready to grant was the private sphere of private beliefs to the Jews, and was ready to grant to individual Jews the right to participate in society despite the fact that they may hold different views about the nature of God or history or God in history. But Jewish identity is not just a matter of private beliefs. Many of us perhaps do not have any more private beliefs on a theological level. But we do have a conscious public identity, the Jewish parhesia, the idea of Jewishness as a community, and not just as a community of believers in individual sets of beliefs. And it is out of this tension between emancipation and the inadequacies of emancipation that modern Jewish life grew. And it is the same tension in a different context, in a political context, which we find in Israel. And it is perhaps best epitomized in a recent series of events which on one hand gave so much pride to Israel, to Zionism, to the Jewish people, but at the same time also filled us in the different aspects of the same process with a feeling of unease and shame and perplexity. And I'm referring to the rescue of Ethiopian Jews. What could be more humane and Jewish and liberal than reaching out to a lost tribe of the Jewish people, a tribe which is different in color and culture and language, as different as any group could be from the mainstreams of modern Jewish life, as the Ethiopian Jews were and are. And here Israel reached out with world Jewish help, rescued those people, and under the law of return, to which Leonard I'll return later, brought those people to Israel. With no quotas, no special legislation, just out of solidarity. This was perhaps one of our finest hours. And then we are confronted with the obscurantist orthodoxy that is questioning, in a very obscure way into which I don't want to go, the exact Jewish status of those Jewish people who were brought to Israel as Jews. So we have on one hand the most humane and open and transcending view of human nature, which we have in reaching out to the Ethiopians, and then we have the most obscurantist element in Jewish orthodoxy and Jewish inbreeding, if you wish, in the reaction of the Orthodox rabbinate. And what is Israel? Is Israel the country that opened its gates to the Ethiopians? Or is Israel the country where so many Ethiopian Jews now feel unhappy because of the problem posed by the chief rabbinate? Israel is both. And it is in that tension, under that tension, we live. Now, we live in a kind of post-revolutionary crisis. And here I want to go back to what I said earlier about how lovely was the Republic under the monarchy. Because when Zionism was conceived as an idea, nobody among those who conceived Zionism as an idea and who was among the first founders of the country thought of the historical context in which it would come to pass. In Herzl's very detailed description of the future Jewish state, both in the book The Jewish State, the Judenstaat, and in Altneuland, he has very little to say about the international context of the establishment of the Jewish state. For Herzl, it was clear that if a Jewish state or a Jewish commonwealth will be established in Palestine, it will be part of an international agreement, and the international standing and status of that country will be assured by its very act of inception. And therefore, the first paragraph of the Zionist Basel program calls for the establishment of a safe Jewish commonwealth under public law. There's no doubt for Herzl, and there was no doubt for the Zionist dreamers and first Zionist generations that once a Jewish state will be established, it will be established through peaceful means and will be recognized as a nation and as a rightful state by everybody whose views are of any consequence. Consequently, in this very detailed description of the Jewish state, Herzl speaks only in one very short paragraph about the army in the Jewish state. And there he says that since the Jewish state will be neutral, it will have no enemies. By definition, it will not be able to have any enemies, and therefore it will not need any army, only some sort of gendarmerie to make sure that border smuggling will not occur across its borders. Now, this is a prophecy. This is the context as envisaged. Now, here, on the other hand, we have Israel, which was born through a war and has lived by its sword for the last 40 years. I don't want to belabor the point, but it's my guess that any other countries that would have come into the world under similar circumstances would not be able to maintain its democratic or liberal structure. I can think that as a political scientist, I can very easily draw up a scenario saying here is a country which on the first day of its inception would be attacked by all its neighbors, which will therefore have to have a very strong army, will have to use more of its GNPs than any other country in the world at the moment for military purposes. Its military leaders will have very strong public visibility, will be politically very central to the nation. What kind of society will emerge out of that if you add to it that the population will be more than quadrupled over 40 years with a philosophy of welfare state, which means that there are a lot of tensions because people expect. What kind of society can you imagine under those circumstances? I know that I would have said this would be a one-party state or a military dictatorship or some sort of developmental dictatorship as we see it in most countries of the third world. The fact is that this did not happen. And the fact is that we do have, and we have already discussed some, and I'll discuss some more, of the problems of a democratic country, but the problems which we discuss are problems of a democratic country. When we discuss the problems of Syria, just to mention France, we're not discussing the problems of a democratic society, we're discussing a different kind of problems. There is, however, a great failure, which I think that the founding fathers and mothers in Israel are responsible for. And some of it may be responsible for some of the difficulties which we are facing today. Zionism never thought that the very establishment of the state of a Jewish Commonwealth will be the end of Zionism or its fulfillment. It saw the establishment of a Commonwealth as the first necessary step for the realization of Zionism as an idea. And this was, of course, certainly the case with socialist Zionists, who had an all-encompassing social and economic and human vision of what kind of society should be established in the land of Israel. Unfortunately, the pressures under which Israel was to come into existence, the fact that it happened after the Holocaust, the fact that Israel was burdened, and I think we have to be frank about it, in its first years by mass immigration which had to be taken in. There was no way of being selective. It would be immoral and unethical to have been selective about immigration. You had to take in, you had to bring in everybody from the concentration camp survivors from the Middle Eastern countries. But this really meant that the abilities of nation building in terms of social structures had to be and were sacrificed on the altar of immediate expediency, which includes the expediency of having to defend a country against those terrible odds. Now, I think this was necessarily historically, but in the process, the leadership of the country sometimes lost sight, because it was fighting for existence, lost sight for some of the qualities for which this existence came into being. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Labour Party and the labor movement in Israel, and I know that Marie Syrkin feels as deeply as I do about it, was that it was not very successful in bringing about a successor generation. the generation of the great revolutionaries, Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, has not been succeeded by a generation of second-generation revolutionaries. And in this respect, we are very much, if I may say, lehavdil, like other revolutionary societies. I mean, whatever one feels about Lenin, he was a revolutionary with a vision. Whatever you say about the present leadership of the Soviet Union, and I can say some very pleasant things at the moment, you're talking at best about managers, at worst about dictators. The vision in a post-revolutionary society, the ability to maintain a permanent revolution, not a la Mao Zedong, but in a positive way, is perhaps an internal tension which no society has yet found a way to realize. We haven't found either, but there we have a problem. Add to that two major failures. One failure is an Israeli failure, and this is the failure of not being able, under the pressures of post-1948, to be as insistent as we should have been in terms of the qualities of society we'd like to see. There is another failure, and this is a failure of the Jewish community all over the world. In all the dreams of Zionism, there was always one given, that once a Jewish commonwealth will be established, once the doors to Eretz Israel will be open, there will be some mass Jewish immigration, not just out of necessity. The greatest failure of the Jewish people in the 20th century has been, in my mind, that after 1948, there was no great massive Jewish immigration from the West. Not 5 million from the United States, 300,000, 200,000, 100,000. We haven't received that reservoir of Jewish energy and intelligence and economic sagacity. We could have said that for 2,000 years Jews could not come to Eretz Israel because it was closed, it was under foreign rule, Jews were not allowed, the conditions were not ripe. Immediately after 1948, you couldn't say that anymore. There was, after 1948, written by an Israeli writer of the older generation, Chaim Hazaz, a very problematical play called Beketz Hayamim, at the end of days, which takes place in the 17th century in some sort of German undisclosed city at the time of Shabtai Tzvi, when there is a messianic fervor and a messenger arrives in a certain city and calls upon the Jews to join the Messiah, never mind the false Messiah, and go to Eretz Israel. And they should have started Sunday morning. And the play takes place in the home of one Jewish family, where the head of the family, Yuspa, a businessman, is ready, because he is a true believer, to go to Eretz Israel the next day. But then over dinner he says to his family, you know, if all of us will go next day, tomorrow, somebody will still have to collect some of the debts which some people owe us. Somebody will still have to sell some of the houses which we won't be able to sell. Why don't I stay for the time being, for a few months, just to get all those things in order? And his family agrees with him. The point is that the next day no Jew shows up at the city square to go to Eretz Israel, because everybody thought that he should be the one to stay behind to take care of the business of all those who went on Aliyah. Now, this is perhaps a very unfair problem, but we have a major failure of the Jewish people. If 500,000 Western, middle-class, intellectual Jewish people would have immigrated to Israel after 1948, some of the problems which we are discussing tonight would not be there, including the problem of religious intolerance. What are we to do? What are we to do if most of the people who come from the United States are very Orthodox and some of them are even Kahana supporters? What are we to do? To lock the door on them? Wouldn't it be much easier and better for all of us if there would be 50,000 liberal Reform Jews coming to Israel, offsetting the few thousand pro-Kahana American Jews. I'm not preaching Aliyah to anybody. I'm just suggesting that we have a problem, and the problem sometimes is not in Israel, the problem sometimes is here. And let us face it, it is the same problem. It's not that we have a problem in Israel. We together have a problem, and we have to face it. I should add that Herzl foresaw that problem. In Altneuland, there is an incredibly interesting story. This is, in the Ethiopian novel, where the traveler to the Jewish land finds himself in the middle of an election campaign which takes place in the already existing Jewish Commonwealth, and the focus of that election campaign is a rabbi who has just arrived from the West. His name is Dr. Gaia, Rabbi Gaia. Gaia means vulture, who was originally anti-Zionist, and then he became a Zionist, and then he came to Eretz Israel, and he suggested, on arriving in Altneuland, in Eretz Israel, that the Arab members of the new society should be deprived of the citizenship rights. And there is an election on that issue, and of course the Sons of Light defeats the Sons of Darkness, and liberal Zionism triumphs over Dr. Gaia, Rabbi Dr. Gaia. Now, this is not exactly the sort of chapter in Altneuland which was taught in schools. I mean, there were other chapters, more enlightening, which were taught in school. But it is there. The danger of that sort of intolerance was not something which the founders of the Jewish state, of the Zionist idea, were completely oblivious to. I want very briefly to comment on 2 points raised by Leonard Fein in his opening remarks, and my comments will be very similar to those of Maurice Syrkin. The law of return. Let me first make it a polemical statement. I hope that one day, and the day will not be far, that there will be a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, in conjunction with Jordan or not. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I think all of us would agree that that Palestinian state should have a Palestinian law of return, that every Palestinian from Lebanon or Kuwait should be entitled to go to Nablus or Hebron or Ramallah or wherever the Palestinian state will be. If it's good for the Arabs, it's good for the Jews. That's one point. My other point on this law of return is perhaps more fundamental. What is the law of return? The law of return specifies the conditions under which people can immigrate to the country. And it makes a very clear distinction between Jewish people who can automatically, without any prior condition, immigrate to Israel and automatically become citizens. And it discriminates in their favor against non-Jewish people who, if they want to immigrate, have to go through other procedures, and they can immigrate, and then they can be naturalized after 3 years. And we have many cases like that. Now, to what should we compare that law? To some abstract idea of what? The United States in the 19th century had an open immigration policy. No country today, virtually no country, has an open immigration policy. What do liberal Western countries have as immigration policies? They have some criteria. In most cases, those criteria are based on the needs of the country to which people immigrate. A country like Canada, the American situation now is a little bit more complex, Australia, they are immigration countries, but they specify that people who immigrate should be healthy, should be have, in most cases, either education, qualification, capital, could contribute to the country. If they don't have it, they can't do it. Then there are some quotas for welfare, for Vietnamese boat people, etc., etc. I mean, we know that welfare is welfare, but that's not policy. Compared to that philosophy, which discriminates against the whole world except those people whom we need in Canada or Australia, the Israeli law of return is the most humane and humanistic law I know of, because it's trying to help the weak and not the strong. It's trying to help those who are in need of the country, and it's not trying to help the country by bringing in people who can do us good. So I can see no problem with the law of return. I can see why Arabs in Israel are not very happy about it. But let me tell you very frankly, if there's going to be a Palestinian state on the West Bank, I hope it's going to exclude Jews, and I will be very unhappy about it. But that's part of the compromise we will have to work out with our Arabs. A Jewish law of return to Israel, a Palestinian law of return to a Palestinian state, which will certainly tell me that I cannot go to Hebron and settle there, which is fine. Despite the fact that I think, no, it does discriminate against me. And I take it as part of the compromise we have to work out. And I'm not an expert on citizenship law, but I understand that somebody who's of British descent can go back to Britain after 10 generations. Somebody who's of Swiss descent can re-emigrate to Switzerland. And I'm not quoting Greece, because it's not perhaps my model democracy in the 20th century, but there is a Greek law of return, etc., etc. So I really do not see a problem here. I can see why Arabs in Israel are not very unhappy about it, just as I can see why Gush Emunim will not be very happy with a Palestinian law in return on the West Bank, and that's fine with me. Hatikva. We all know where the music comes from. It's not very Jewish, but never mind about that. Leonard is really setting up a very high standard for a national anthem. Either it is to be so innocuous that everybody can agree with it, or society has been so uniform that everybody can agree with it. Now, in all fairness, and I don't want to put too much stress on the symbolism, but symbolism is symbolism. The Marseillaise. Half of France cannot stand the Marseillaise because it stands for the French Revolution. Half of France is right-wing Catholic and is not for the French Revolution. I mean, this has been the dividing line of French politics since 1789. And that's why you have all those pendulums in French politics. And some revolutions and other. And counter-revolutions. And the great Democrat de Gaulle, who came to power by the army. Not Arik Sharon, General de Gaulle. The Marseillaise is not the consensus of all Frenchmen. The fact that those who do not agree to the Marseillaise do not belong to a national minority, but happen to belong to a Catholic, reactionary, right-wing, slightly anti-Semitic group of French people does not diminish the right to be unhappy with the Marseillaise. And it is still the French national anthem. God save the Queen. I don't know whether the British Labour Party is Republican, but some parts of it were Republican. Did the fact that there is a monarchy in Britain, and it's still more or less a legitimate monarchy, mean that a person should, if somebody is a Republican, he cannot sing the anthem? There is a problem here. An anthem tries to bring out the widest common denominator, not an indiscriminate consensus. And again, I realize what the problem is for an Israeli Arab. I understand it. Just as I understand how somebody who belongs to a minority in France or in Britain feels about so much of the symbolism of British law, including the fact that in the British House of Lords you have the Archbishop of Canterbury and York and 6th Bishop of the established Church of England. This is in England. Imagine the two chief rabbis would have been by law members of the Israeli Knesset. What would we have said about Orthodoxy? And rightly so, about Orthodoxy. So what I suggest is that those symbols are very important, but if we view the liberalism, or lack of it, of a political establishment just by the symbols, we're doing injustice to the structure of society. Because I want to be very frank, and here I think I have to disagree with my friend Leonard Fein. Law of return, Hatikva. When we look at the alternative would be a multi-ethnic, indiscriminate, non-discriminating, United States that happens to be on the Eastern Mediterranean. Israel is not that and will not become. And our problem is how, on one hand, to maintain Israel as a Jewish state in the way in which France is French and it is Italian, while insisting that this does not infringe on the personal and communal rights of minorities. This is a very difficult task. It's a task in which very few countries in the democratic West have been successful. Certainly they have not been successful under pressure of war. Certainly the United States was less successful in handling that issue during World War II when it had to deal with American or Japanese origin compared to the way in which we are handling, and not always very successfully, the Arab problem. So in this real world, we have a real problem. And the problem is that Zionism is not accommodationism to norms which have grown in a different set of values and ideas. If I may take an analogy, I think we are all mature enough to realize that equal rights for women does not mean that in order to be equal, women have to be like men. They are entitled to be equal as women, and as their own understanding of women it means to them. And men have to accept that. The self-determination of the Jewish people, based on liberalism and universalism and equal rights, cannot be viewed on the basis of how others view what Jewish self-determination is. Jewish self-determination is a decision the Jewish people have to take within a liberal tradition, within a universal ethos, out of which we are a part, and to which we have to relate. There are basically two ways, it seems to me, to think of internationalism. One is the abstract, if I may be technical for a moment, and the other is the mediated. The abstract way of internationalism says every human being is directly, without any mediation, without any intermediate organs or institutions, a member of the human race. And we have to view him or her as a human being. There is another view of internationalism to which I subscribe, and this is a mediated one. It has its root in concepts of liberal nationalism as that of Mazzini, where Mazzini said, the Italian fighter for Italian liberation, where he said, by being a member of my nation, I am a citizen of the world. One had to add to that, I have to admit the right of any other human being to be member of his nation. This is true. And therefore, it is through one's own identity with the community that one becomes a member of the human race and recognizes the other, not as an abstract human being, but as an Englishman or Englishwoman or a Frenchman or a Palestinian, not an abstract human being. And this is the kind of fight in which we are engaged. I think this fight has become much more difficult because of the consequences of the 1967 war, which on one hand has given Israel elation and the Jewish people a feeling of deliverance, which of course has been unprecedented. But it has burdened us with occupied territories, but what is much more than that, occupied human beings. The debate whether the territories are occupied or liberated seems to me as a political philosopher absurd, A territory cannot be free, a territory cannot be occupied, because it's an inanimate object, and inanimate objects do not have the quality of being either free or occupied. Human beings have that quality. And this seems to me to be what we will have to face in the next few years. And let me therefore read to you something I wrote some time ago. Some of you may know it, when I tried to define in a form of what I call the Zionist credo, what Zionism, liberal Zionism, means to me, and I hope to many Israelis and Jewish people outside of Israel. We are the people of the book. We are also a people heavy with memory. Let us therefore remember, nizkor, what Zionism is. Let us remember that Zionism is about the future, not about the past. Let us remember that Zionism, while embedded in history, should never be imprisoned by it. Let us remember that Zionism means listening to the voice of our own people, not silencing the voices of others. Let us remember that Zionism is about national self-consciousness, not about real estate. Let us remember that Zionism is about getting the Jewish people back into history, not opting out of it. Let us remember that Zionism is about being Jewish, but also about being human, kechol hagoyim, but not like the worst of them. Let us remember that Zionism is about building, not about destroying. Let us remember that Zionism is about liberation, not about occupation. Let us remember that Zionism is about people, not about territories.
You've heard two very forceful statements. I have some reactions, but since being a moderator is about restraint, I will hold on them and permit you to have at either or both of the speakers for the next 15 minutes or so, at which point I will, in 1 minute, set the record straight, and then we will adjourn. So it's your turn. If you'll raise your hands, the obvious, questions only, please, not statements, and do try to speak up so that I don't have to repeat. We'll start with you. No, behind you, please. Thank you.
The whole question of liberal Zionism, to me, reflects on a larger question, and that is that Judaism is not only a nationality, but also a religion. And when talking about a democracy within Israel, a state can have a democracy as a form of government. My question is, can a religion also be democratic, or by definition, is it necessary to be theocratic, whatever that will mean, and therefore eliminate democracy? That's one question. And connected to that is another one. I'm addressing them to both the speakers. Professor Avineri, you quoted people of the book, and I'm assuming that you're referring to the Bible, which then goes back to, is the Bible viewed as a history book, or is it also viewed as a religious manifesto? And when you concluded by saying, what is Jewish, and then quoting Kachol Hagayim, the Bible usually refers to that phrase, Kachol Hagayim, in a negative sense, that Jewish people must be distinct and separate from the other nations, that we should not strive to be Kachol Hagayim.
I merely call to your attention before asking Marie Syrkin to respond first that next week's symposium on the 12th is precisely about liberalism and religion and religious values in our tradition, in our experience, in our current context. So half of the question will be answered then. Yes.
Well, as to whether democracy and religion are compatible, I assume that in the United States, for instance, incidentally, I'm not a specialist on any question involving orthodoxy, etc. I'm sure the young lady who asked the question knows much more than I do about it. But simply taking the example of the United States, we assume that separation of church and state, or synagogue and state, are the conditions for a democratic society. Now, you know that historically it was essentially the misfortune of Israel, from my point of view, that Ben-Gurion was obliged from the beginning to have a coalition with religious parties. This may sound very unpleasant to some of you, but had Ben-Gurion been enabled to have a government simply which incorporated the secular and the social views of the movement that he represented and the movement which created the state, many of the ensuing troubles which came by the fact that a theocratic element entered in, which as Shlomo Avineri told you, the most monstrous intrusions upon the personal life of the citizens. Now, I don't wish to sound in any way offensive to people of belief, but to me, of course, and I imagine to a great many who've been brought up in the notion that there has to be a separation between church and state, this particular combination is a very difficult one. I think, probably could be resolved in political terms. Shlomo Avineri will know much more about that than I do. If let's, by some miracle, the coalition would give way to and we would have instead a secular labor government. I know this sounds very partisan. I think that many, which would have the strength to promulgate through the Knesset laws which would control, since there is no constitution, some of the religious excesses. I think many of the problems would be solved. But you have the absurdity which Shlomo Avineri quoted to you. You have the Ethiopian Jews brought in so heroically, so superbly, and then you have this business about taking a bath and not taking a bath and making the whole tribe miserable and creating already a history, justified or unjustified, of discrimination. Now, having said all this, I will add that I think one of the problems is, which again was raised here, is that despite all that I say, what I feel so completely in accord with everything that Avineri said, sound like a yes woman in this regard, that, look, one of the tragedies has been, as I really look at the scene, and as I've spoken about it with some of my chaverim who are of the secular kind, there's the terrible question. That's right, all what the excesses of the religious bloc are there, but at the same time, what do we see? Where is the source of Aliyah? I've met Orthodox boys from Brooklyn sitting in Gush Emonim who spoke in pseudo-messianic terms which made my hair stand on end, but at the same time I saw the zeal and the passion that animated them. There was no such zeal and it was the only place where I saw that zeal and passion. I had to go back in memories to find its equivalent. And when you have Yerida, it is not they who go back. So that in a sense, we go back. The problems are those of the Jewish people everywhere as a whole. But I don't see any contradiction between a democratic secular state, as in the United States, in which religion plays its role and has all the rights to it which it should enjoy.
I think I should really respond to the second part, which was more directed to me. I also agree with what Marie Syrkin said in response to your first part. Now, yes, when I meant the book, I certainly meant, metaphorically, the Bible. How do we understand it? This is something about which I think we disagree. But nonetheless, we refer to the same book. And one of the great things about Israel and about the Jewish people generally today is that we are referring to the same book and read different things into it. To many of us, it is a religious book of divine revelation. Far be it from me, and God forbid, to then adjudicate which of the different interpreters is the right interpretation. I mean, there's a lot of love of Israel, about Israel, between the various religious groups about interpretation. You see, Neturei Karta, the Satmar Rebbe, is a very devout Jew. He quotes the Bible with much more authority than I do. He happens to be one of the enemies of the people of Israel. As far as I understand it, he thinks differently. He thinks that we are the enemies of the people of Israel. But then, to many of us, the book means our history, a prophetic mission, a moral or ethical code. And the fact that we disagree what the book means still means that we are united by the book, and we have to have enough tolerance to understand and see each other as a legitimate interpretation of that common history over which we disagree. It's a very difficult pluralism within unity. Let me add one further thing about Kechol HaGoyim. Again, I don't want to go into biblical interpretation. I meant Kechol HaGoyim, I said Kechol HaGoyim by saying humanistic. And I know that may strike somebody who is Orthodox in a very offensive way. But let me remind you that when the people of Israel for the first time asked for a king, they said, Kechol HaGoyim. We want a king like all the other nations. And the initial reaction of Samuel the prophet was not a very positive one. But then somehow God accommodated himself, if I may say so, to the wishes of the people of Israel to be Kechol HaGoyim. The first king wasn't really a great success story, but the second one was King David, from whose descendants the Messiah will come. And the third one was King Solomon, who builds a temple. So this very interesting enterprise of those Jews wanting to be Kechol HaGoyim ended up with King David. The Solomon may even end up with Melech HaMashiach. So it's a little bit more of a complicated history than just saying Kechol HaGoyim is something which the Bible denied and said no.
A very brief footnote to the response. I'm engaged just now in a correspondence with a number of Orthodox rabbis who've taken exception to some things that we've published in Moment, some things I've written, some things Rabbi Harold Schulweis has written. And it's, to my way of thinking, a rather interesting correspondence. Those of you who subscribe will read it, I think, in the January-February issue. One of the rabbis, a rather engaging young man, writes to me and says, Fein, I like what you do. I applaud what you do. You practice and you preach something that I would call Jewishism. And it's a very nice thing, this Jewishism. Please don't confuse it with Judaism. That's what I practice and preach. And what he is saying, in effect, is, look, pluralism makes a lot of sense when people like you or Schulweis or Avineri call for pluralism. I understand it, because your fundamental Weltanschauung holds that truth is fallible. My truth is not fallible. My truth is revealed. Don't ask me to be tolerant. I can love you, but given that my truth is infallible, I can't deal with you in the way in which you propose, and I'm happy for it, to deal with me. So there's some interesting stuff here which affects, I think, not only Israel, but our relationship to one another in this country, which is getting, in these dimensions, nastier almost daily. We'll talk about that another time. Another hand, please. Sir.
I have a question to Professor Avineri. You, in your talk, charged the world Jewry with a major failure. You were referring specifically to free Jews in the West with failing to make Aliyah in any significant numbers since 1948. I want to ask you a question about an implied tension in liberal Zionism in this room. Both you and Professor Syrkin praised Leonard Fein on the contributions on the existence of Moment magazine by way of example, and I agree, it's a very fine publication. It is a major publication in American Jewish life, and its underlying basis, its aura, its sort of feeling you get from years of reading it is that there is a permanent, a necessity, a valid sort of Jewish reason to be in America, something which you say is detrimental to the security of the state of Israel. Are we to accept this failure of Western Jews to make Aliyah as permanent? Are we to accept the existence of Moment in America as permanent?
It's a moment. It's a moment.
Listen, even I will concede that I hope Israel lasts longer than Moment. That's all right.
Okay. I think I got the point. You see, I'm a pluralist. I think that in the house of Israel there are many rooms. even rooms with which I disagree. To some I'll never enter. Others I'll enter and have a discussion. Or they even invite me to have a discussion with them. So I think the question is not either or. Let me tell you how I would see that. I'm talking about the real world, not an ideal world. I think that there will be, in the foreseeable future, many Jewish people in the diaspora. I'm not saying what I would like to see. I mean, the Messianic age, for me, has a lot of other meanings as well. I start from the assumption that the diaspora is here to stay, not forever, because I don't know what stays forever. For the time being, I'd like to see a few 100,000 Jews in Israel coming from the Western diaspora. The question is not either or. Do all of them have to come? Or if I say that it would be good to come, I'm not making a plea for Aliyah. You see, very good question. Because I myself was brought to Israel when I was 5 years old. When I fill out a form, I have always to say, Ala la'aretz in this year. I didn't really come on Aliyah when I was 5 years old. Yeah? I was brought. I don't think I have the moral right to preach to other people, something which I myself have not done. For me, Israel is an existential reality. It's not a choice. So therefore, I think I shouldn't preach to others what I haven't done myself. On the other hand, I respect the pluralism of views. I mean, if I have to preach to people, I'll preach to the Orthodox people to stop being Orthodox. I'll preach to the Reform people to be a little less Reform. I mean, there are a lot of things which I can preach to people to be as I want them to be. But I take people as they are. Instead, I think it would be a very good idea if people who care for Israel, not those who don't. I'm not suggesting that Satmar Rebbe comes to Israel. But I'm talking about concerned people who care about Israel, who care about liberalism, about pluralism, about religious pluralism. If those people who care so deeply, if some of them, not all of them, chas v'chalila, some of them, 10,000 a year would come to Israel, our situation would be better. Now, this may be a very pragmatic attitude. It doesn't have a messianic fervor. It doesn't paint everything in black and white. It doesn't have absolutist answers, and therefore somebody who's looking for absolutist answers, not my department. But nonetheless, I think one can make that statement without quarreling with the legitimacy of other positions, which I respect, and I see them as part of the legitimate plurality of the Jewish experience. As I was trying to respond to the First Lady questioner, I think I have to respect in the same way other views with which I happen to disagree on one issue or many issues. Nonetheless, why not do that disagreement in Jerusalem? It would be much more fun.
May I quote something? In connection with Aliyah, and again, I certainly am in no position to moralize about Aliyah, I think of something that Golda Meir said, which I have found in her inimitable, simple way, incredibly moving. In 1967, there was, of course, the extraordinary outburst of American youth rushing to reach the country and assist in the defense, which they thought of an imminently threatened Israel. And this was, of course, in June. In September, a lot of these young people were rushing away, and when Golda, as she told the story, went to speak to some of them, they said, well, we have to get back to college. We have to enlist. And she said to them something which I think sums up the paradox of our situation. She said, I don't understand you. You are ready to come and die with us. Why are you not ready to come and live with us? So that, in a sense, Aliyah the rush towards Israel is something very profound, because in moments of crisis, we see this supposedly alienated people rushing. But that, of course, is the tragic paradox that so many, these bright young students who would have been such an asset, they were ready to die for Israel, and certainly not come in September and enroll. They were ready to forfeit, but not to live in Israel.
As a biblicist, I would like to footnote that to ask my question to Professor Avineri. so many thousands of years the Oriental Jews were brought as a Jew according to the halakha, according to the law. So I don't have any problem with the problem of crisis and liberal Zionism. It's your problem. And I think that the problem was very, very clear. You have a tremendous problem. The tremendous problem that you have, that you never address the issue of the beauty of the religion, not, as Professor Avineri quoted 3 times the Sakna Rabbi, because the Sakna Rabbi is not Moses who gave the laws in Sinai. The Sakna Rabbi is an Orthodox extreme one. It is what you call normative Judaism. Orthodoxy, which is beautiful religion, which try to show that the religion has some validity morally.
Get off
liberal
this.
point of view. If I'm a liberal, I would take Amos. I would take the prophets. You cannot take the prophets and say that the book is historical. Is historical. The prophets are not historical because the prophets are the lawyers of the book. The question is, how does the social liberal Zionists take the Oriental Jews in Israel, which will be a majority, or maybe it's a majority, but not a majority in the world, into their discussion? Because it is relevant to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think you would agree that if you tell me that I have a problem and you're Jewish, then it's not I that have a problem, both of us have a problem. Okay. So we have a problem. My problem is maybe different from yours. Your may be different from your wife's. We never know. I mean, we have a...
I, as an Oriental Jew, have no problem about halakha and religion.
Okay.
I'm not pluralistic.
Okay.
Never pluralistic.
Okay.
I don't have a problem.
Okay. So you don't have it. You. I know that. So, I mean, all of us have our own problems. So, I mean, pick your choice.
Do you guys want to trade?
Okay. I'm not trying to be facetious. What I'm saying is that different Jewish communities, the different Jewish philosophies, so long as they view themselves as Jewish, and if they think they have a problem, I suggest to other Jews to listen to the definition of that problem and to realize that we all have that problem if one group of Jews has a problem. If the Ethiopian Jews have a problem in Israel, it's not the problem of the Ethiopian Jews, it's my problem. Now, I think that in terms of your question about Oriental Jews, you will find among Oriental Jews in Israel a great plurality of views and philosophies as well. I don't think they speak, or I don't think they should speak in one voice, not only because Yemenite Jews have a different religious tradition from Iraqi Jews. They don't even pray in the same synagogue, which is fine. It's part of the pluralism. Some of the religious rites are different, which is fine. This is part of the pluralism I'm talking about. So we're not talking about a uniform Oriental Judaism confronting something else. And politically, you will find religious Oriental Jews today much more assertive and much more visible in the public life in Israel as it should be. And I have no doubt whatsoever that in the future it will be more so. Well, I'm just trying to answer the question. Okay, so we happen to disagree, and I think we have to find ways, if we live in Israel. It's much more easy, you see. It's much more easy if you live in a non-Jewish society to let the Goyim take care of the way in which you run the state, and then each Jewish community has its own community center, synagogue, etc., and doesn't have to make decisions about public life. The difficult thing and the lovely thing about Israel is that all those different Jewish communities have to make decisions about common public life. And there we have a problem how we live together with each other and how we respect each other's different cultures, different views, different religious views, and different non-religious or social views. This is a problem, I think, which we have and to which I tried at least to address myself.
Or to put the matter somewhat differently, those of us here who, as I and any number of my friends, feel free to incorporate religious metaphor into their language, off of whose tongues words like Mashiach and kedusha, holiness, sanctity, rolls so glibly, have a degree of freedom, to which Shlomo Avineri just alluded, that is not quite so readily available in Israel, where those words tend to be invested by some parts of the population with substantive and literal meaning. And you don't mess around with words that are taken literally by a significant segment of the population. The tragedy, to my way of thinking, of the mixture of religion and state in Israel is not that it ends up in stone throwing or nastiness. The tragedy is that the nature of the religious understanding of those who have wielded political power, those religious folks who have wielded political power, has rendered religion inaccessible to a very large majority of young Israelis. The real tragedy is that in Israel one has an either-or choice, apparently. It is not quite that blatant, but for very many Ashkenazim, it's quite different for the Sephardic community.
It's changing.
It's beginning to change slowly, and I'm not sure, by the way, Shlomo, in which direction it's changing, because for some people it's changing for the worse because of the growing extremism of the right. When the Neturei Karta said last week, you may have been on the road already, that they applied for membership in the Palestine National Council, all right, so the Neturei Karta are crazy, so everybody writes them off. When a member of the government says that a bus turns over and has an accident because the families of the kids on that school bus were not adequately observant of the Shabbat, then a whole generation of youth says, if that's Judaism, I'm an Israeli. And you know what the data are when youngsters are asked, do you consider yourself Jewish or do you consider yourself Israeli? That, in turn, cuts people off, interrupts the dialogue between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. It also, it seems to me, increasingly interrupts the dialogue between Israel and the diaspora. Because if there is anything that's happening in the American diaspora, at least, that's interesting in the last 10 years, it's people's reawakened interest in, let me put it as gently as I can, religious metaphor, or in a religious sensibility, a new accessibility to the language and the notions and some of the structures of religious belief. That we're going to talk about next time. I am disturbed, and some of you know the story, by the Israeli who comes to me, as one did last Pesach, and says, I must see you, a high official of the Jewish agency. I have an important problem to discuss, and we make a date. Forgetting that it's Chol HaMoed Pesach, make a date to meet him in a restaurant in New York City. We go in, and I remember where we are and when we are doing this thing, and so I order eggs and matzah. And he, knowing that I have a labor Zionist background, says, you? Meaning, I thought you were enlightened. I thought that you were a secular Jew. Why would you insist on eating matzah during Pesach? And I said, yeah, me. He said, would you mind if I ordered a pastrami sandwich? I said, suit yourself. He orders a pastrami sandwich, I'm eating matzah, and he says, look, I've come here to talk with you about the growing rift between Israel and the diaspora. What can we do to repair it? I said, stop ordering pastrami sandwiches. He didn't know what I meant, right? All right, one more question, and then it's not going to be over. Then you are at liberty to have at our speakers in the reception in the back of the auditorium. Yes?
This is for Dr. Syrkin.
If you could stand up and speak up, then we won't have to repeat the question.
This is sort of a follow-up to the question, the point raised by the young lady before. In many of your references to liberal Zionism, you refer to it in terms that, while not explicitly doing so, virtually excluded a religious Zionism, which I find very disturbing. In the sense that, I mean, just looking back at some of the history, the intense secularism of the labor Zionists who founded Israel, I think, to a certain extent, created, while not justifying, but did help create some of the religious extremism in certain religious elements in Israel today. And I think it also almost forgets some certain very important historical, sociological realities that, in the context of a lack of immediate, intense crisis, normally it's the religious environment of Judaism that survives, that continues. Whether it's in the Jewish community in the United States or in a deep commitment to the future of the state of Israel in Israel.
Okay.
You know, it sort of forgets the distinction, just as Judaism, the Jewish people, is both religious and national. Zionism, a Zionism that is not both religious and national, may not really survive and certainly is creating problems, and sort of ignores the possibility of a religious rabbi, of an Orthodox rabbi, making aliyah, creating a community in Israel, and then saying from the pulpit of an Orthodox synagogue that if the secular military and political authorities said, for the sake of peace with the Arabs, Israel has to withdraw from the West Bank, and he will lead his religious Orthodox community out of the West Bank into pre-67 Israel.
Okay. Thank you.
What you say is of course the force of religion as the cohesive element in throughout Jewish history. I wouldn't deny, but I think we live in a secular age. Things have changed historically. Furthermore, it seems to me, I think you forget that Israel was created by if I think of the pioneer generation, it's the creation of a group of atheistic, secular Jews who were demonstratively anti-religious, I mean, to ridiculous extremes, the early chalutzim in the early kibbutzim, yet they had their religion. They had, in their way, a fervor, a messianic fervor, one can say, and a passion which was quite as powerful and led them to acts of heroism, self-immolation, and sacrifice, which I don't have to remind you of. Anyone who knows a little bit of Zionist history knows in what measure Israel is the creation of that original group. However, just as the kibbutz has undergone many changes in its attitude, the original village atheism, in which you have a ball on Yom Kippur, is over. On the contrary, there is an observance of tradition, and I see no reason why in Israel the coexistence of religion is a powerful force, whose immense influence I certainly wouldn't dream of denying, for many Jews, cannot coexist with essentially secular Jews who, while no longer violently atheistic as they were demonstratively so once upon a time, as I said, this village atheism, nevertheless reject the rigid formulas of Orthodox Judaism, as in the United States. I mean, you accept the fact that in the United States, Jews in the diaspora can exist in any form of religious observance that they please, and yet they can form together some kind of a Jewish community, if that is possible. I think the antithesis is an unreal one. Furthermore, unless recognition is given to the secular character not only of the age, essentially, we live in a secular world. You have the tide of fundamentalism in the Middle East. We don't admire Khomeini. We consider that a reversion to something. The so-called enlightened secular age is with us. We have to come to terms with it, and certainly one of the terms is what we mean by pluralism, that there can be religious groups. The only danger is, and the only objection in Zionism to that is when it encroaches on the rights, the civil rights of the rest of the population. Now that makes an intolerable situation. I understand, of course, that religion, you can't argue with a believer. He knows. I've spoken to some, and I marvel at the simplicity and the faith. Consequently, it's not an arguable thing. I don't know exactly how nevertheless, that would be true of a Catholic in the United States, and yet no Catholics, we try very hard to keep the influence of the church, insofar as possible, out of the public schools. out of the entire government structure. I don't see why that is less possible and yet we consider ourselves a very tolerant society. I don't see why that is less possible in Israel.
No, excuse me. We really are to adjourn. Shlomo Avineri wants to add one word. I want to add one word. For those of you who are antsy to participate in the reception, I merely tell you that when I have said we are adjourned, the doors behind you will magically open, and if you walk through them, you will have passed into the reception. Shlomo.
Very briefly, religious Zionism has undergone a very significant transformation, mainly around 1967. Before 1967, religious Zionism was very non-messianic. And the religious establishment historically was originally anti-Zionist. Let's not forget about it. And with this kind of non-messianic, pragmatic religious Zionism, labor Zionism lived in cohabitation, if I may use the term, for 30 years. I mean, the two major political powers between 1935 and 1967 were always a coalition of the Labour Party and the Mizrahi, Poel Mizrahi, the Mafdal, precisely because it was a non-messianic religious Zionism. What happened to religious Zionism, or to some parts of religious Zionism after 1967, is that they started to identify the secular political state of Israel brought about by human agency as the messianic incarnation, or the beginning of messianic incarnation. And therein lies a very great danger, both in terms of how you read Zionism and, I think, also Jewish religion, and there is then a great difficulty of living together with such a interpretation of recent history, which then stops being human history and becomes already a sort of transcendental history in which human beings cannot really make decisions about their own future, about political decisions. And we should never lose sight that there has been that kind of transformation within religious Zionism that has not made life in Israel easier for the coalescence and the mutual tolerance between religious and non-religious Jews.
This is, you will understand, extraordinarily difficult for me. There are so many areas of this conversation in which I would love to participate. I shan't. The hour is late. I conclude with two observations. One, it is dangerous, of course, to infer the attitudes of an audience from 5 or 6 questions asked by that audience. But I consider it some index of the temper of the times that responding to 2 speakers, each of whom said explicitly and forcefully that the occupation of the West Bank is a very bad thing for the state of Israel, no one in the audience said, I want to challenge you on that. 2 years ago, fine, you had your chance. 2 years ago at least, that position would not have passed quite so unchallenged. Second, I consider it somewhat unfair to discuss Israel in its context and distinguish between its context and the American context and ask for a particular understanding of Israel that relates particularly to its special context, and then when it is convenient to refer to church-state separation in this country and to analogize between the needs for such separation in Israel. If the context of Israel is what determines our understanding of the state, one of the elements of the context is that a very significant number of the people of that country have a religious sensibility, belief, whatever, and a very significant number of others in that country are, it seems to me, artificially and damagingly severed from precisely that sensibility and that belief. That is the context, and not the separation that a non-Christian, non-confessional state called the United States, the tradition of separation that this country uniquely has. Those are my 2 observations. My third is merely an expression on your behalf of enormous thanks to Shlomo Avineri and to Marie Syrkin for their words tonight.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.